let's get to it now by welcoming our guests. Dr. Michael Vickers served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence from 2011 to 2015. If you're not really clear on what that role entails, he served essentially as the Chief Executive Officer of the Defense Intelligence Enterprise. It's an $80 billion, 180,000 person global operation that includes the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, the Defense Security Service, the intelligence components, as well as the military services and combatant commands. He played a major policy and planning role in the operation that killed Osama bin Laden. These are all things also that are covered in his book, By All Means Available, Memoirs of a Life in Intelligence, Special Operations, and Strategy. It's available now on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. Dr. Vickers, welcome.
Thank you, Suzanne. Great to be with you.
Our second guest today, Ambassador Joe Detrani. Joe has served the country in so many critical roles over the past years, many of them very closely tied to China. He is currently participating in Track 2 talks on China as well. Ambassador Detrani served as Director of the National Counter-Proliferation Center, as former Special Envoy for 6-party talks with North Korea, and as the U.S. representative to the Korea Energy Development Organization. He's the former CIA Director of East Asia Operations. He served as the Associate Director of National Intelligence and Mission Manager for North Korea. He's also served as a Special Advisor to the Director of National Intelligence, and he currently serves on the Board of Managers at Sandia National Laboratories. Welcome, Joe. I think it's an amazing amount of experience that we have on this call today, and I really want to thank you both for taking the time to talk about this. I know that the issue of strategic alliances is very important to both of you, and you have a really interesting dynamic on both of them. So welcome, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Would you like to kick things off?
Yep. So, Suzanne and I have traveled to Ukraine 3 times this year. During those trips, we've heard a lot about the topic of alliances. Dr. Vickers, I just finished your book. That was a topic that was throughout the book. One of those alliances that we talk a lot about today is the alliance between China and Russia. It's top of mind for many Cipher Brief readers and experts. And I wanted to start, if we could, maybe with a trip back in time during the Cold War, where you described a meeting in China that you and Ambassador Detrani attended together. And that was a very different time and a very different relationship that the West had with China. Could you maybe describe a little bit of that to help us understand how things worked back then with China?
And how they've changed.
Sure. So during the last decade and a half, roughly, of the Cold War, we had a strategic partnership with China, that was first opened by President Nixon, and then relations were normalized under President Carter. And the basis for it was really our competition, Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. And so it spanned everything from radar sites to collect telemetry. But my former boss, Bob Gates, talks about that in his memoir, against Soviet missile systems. But also they were our biggest arms supplier for the largest and most successful covert action program in history, the Afghanistan Covert Action Program that ended up driving the Soviets out of Afghanistan and helping to bring an end to the Cold War. And that lasted through the end of the Cold War, and then shifted to engagement in the 90s, particularly economic engagement, and then became more competitive as the decades rolled on to the strategic competition we have today. And Ambassador Detrani can talk to that better than me.
Oh, Michael, I think that was great. If I may just add, it was an honor working with Michael Vickers. We had a very close strategic relationship with the People's Republic of China. And indeed, as Michael indicated, and his book speaks very clearly about, China provided a significant amount of weaponry necessary to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan. That was major. And you alluded to a minute ago, Michael, talking about the strategic relationship we have with China to monitor Soviet strategic forces. So we had, this was Deng Xiaoping Deng Xiaoping, who came in 1978 for a China that was the most backward country in East Asia, and said, let's get a relationship with the United States. And he basically enshrined that relationship with Brzezinski and President Carter. And we moved forward, and we did a lot of good work together with the People's Republic of China. And again, that's Deng Xiaoping working with President Carter, and then obviously President Ronald Reagan. And Bill Casey had a big part of that equation in his grips. He was a strong anti-communist advocate, and he was a strong advocate for the work we were doing. And Michael, I give you a lot of credit for the outstanding work you did working with the Chinese.
Well, thank you, and you too, Joe. And then Brad, to the specifics of your question, that meeting was about, we were about to escalate the secret war very dramatically. And so that meeting was to ask the Chinese to go along with that major escalation. We had to do it with all our partners, with the Pakistanis, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Brits, et cetera, this large covert alliance, and turned out to be a successful meeting.
Well, it was a fascinating scene, and I think it's a really interesting place to start this conversation today, because wow, China is much different today than it certainly was back then, and so much has changed in the world. You've talked a lot about, you mentioned in your book the tacit alliance between China and Russia today, posing the threat that it does. How could China have changed so rapidly? Maybe is a next question from that strategic alliance that we had back then. What dynamics really were in play to put us where we are today, where we don't have a strategic alliance, and now we're talking about a different alliance that China has and the threats that they propose? How can we understand how we've changed so rapidly?
Yeah, so one, it's a pattern of history that former allies, once they've won a war, as we did collectively in the Cold War, then maybe find their interests diverging. So, Britain and Germany were aligned against Napoleonic France. We were aligned with the Soviet Union in World War II, and then Cold War immediately followed. And then China was similar in some respects. And, a couple points. One, Deng Xiaoping, that Ambassador Detrani mentioned, had this famous aphorism, hide your capabilities and bide your time, which meant until China got strong, it shouldn't provoke the United States. She may be doing that a little too early these days, but that's a matter for another debate. But also the Chinese were the best students of Desert Storm. They looked at how the US won quickly in Desert Storm, and the big lesson they took out of it was do not allow the United States to come in to build up combat power in a theater for many months before a war, to try to keep them at bay if you ever have to fight them. And that became the origins of what we in DoD call their anti-access aerial denial strategy, that started a big missile buildup and other things to aim at American air bases close in the region, and surface naval combatants and aircraft carriers. And they've gotten quite good at that, and they've expanded into space and other areas. And then since, and Ambassador Detrani can talk to this in more detail, since she has come to power particularly, they've become more aggressive and maybe accelerated their timeline.
No, I couldn't agree more with everything you said, Michael. I think President Xi Jinping really, his assertive approach, you talked about Deng Xiaoping, hide your capabilities, bide your time. And this carried through even with Jiang Zemin, the successor to Deng Xiaoping, and even Hu Jintao. And Xi Jinping was the vice president of Hu Jintao. So with the Xi Jinping, we're seeing a much more assertive approach. And I think a part of this is the nexus is in 1997 with the reversion of Hong Kong back to the People's Republic of China. And this is after 156 years where the British were had control of Hong Kong after the first Opium War in 1838. And the reversion now in 1997 for 50 years of basic law, which is one country, two systems, equal, liang zhi. And Xi Jinping changed that certainly in Hong Kong with the national security law. So Yes, I totally agree with everything you said, Michael. But I think it's indicative of the leadership that China has right now, and Xi Jinping's approach to addressing issues related to not only the United States, but China's position in the world, where China aspires, and I think Xi Jinping sees it that way and has said it that way, to be by 19, if you will, 2049, the sentinel of the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. That centennial will be, China will be the preeminent global power. I think Xi Jinping has put that out there. So I think this is the progression we're seeing presently with China, and certainly their relationship with the Russian Federation and Iran and North Korea, I might add.
And, just one more point on that, Putin and Xi both share a view that the United States is weak and in decline. And, there's this famous statement by Xi that, this is a once in a century opportunity to transform the international system, in particularly China's, but also Russia's favor.
So let me follow up with that with a question. I think when Russia invaded Ukraine in February of last year, it was a very black and white issue for the United States, which obviously supported Ukraine in this effort. But much of the world didn't take a side and stayed on the sidelines. And now you're seeing China try to take advantage of opportunities for new partnerships and new alliances that it hasn't had in the past. So how concerned are you about the rest of the world out there that is not taking a side and certainly is not lining up on the side of the United States, and how new alliances in the future might impact future U.S. national security?
Well, I'm very concerned. I mean, one of the characteristics of this strategic competition or new Cold War is that it's global in scope, for influence of all kinds. And, with the Ukraine war, we have strengthened our relations in Europe, but in the global South, we're not doing very well. And both China and Russia have made inroads, and they see opportunities, I think, increasing opportunities in the Middle East. There's been efforts to supplant the dollar as the dominant international currency with the so-called BRICS, and throwing in Iran for good measure, with the China, Brazil, India, Russia, and so there's a global competition going on that we need to take seriously.
No, I totally agree with that. And, you mentioned the BRICS, Michael, and that's right on. And now we see a number of other countries joining the BRICS, but I don't see that as, I see that as China asserting itself with Russia, trying to displace, if you will, the US dollar and have the renminbi become the currency, preferred currency globally. This is not going to happen. This is not going to happen. But that alliance, and I think the axis of authoritarianism, that alliance between China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, I mean, that's the focus point. That's the focal point of indeed the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes India, and now Iran. That's also part of it, where we see joint military exercises. But I think the axis of authoritarianism, that those states, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, I think that's the focal point when we look at global national security. And that has to be of concern to us. And I think this is, and I think I don't want to get into it, defer to Michael and your questions, but I think this is where President Biden is responding to with AUKUS and what we're doing, certainly with South Korea and Japan. We're showing that we will be assertive also, and we will protect whether it's the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. With you mentioned Ukraine, so I agree. I agree. This is a very, very critical moment with China and Russia seeking greater alliances with a number of these others. You mentioned the global South. There's no question, but I think that focal point of those four major states, Iran, North Korea, certainly Russia and China are the focus of that thrust.
Right.
Before this this conversation today, I pulled just some really quick facts, in particular related to China and Russia that we've mentioned a few times. Putin and Xi Jinping have met a total of 42 times over the past 10 years. The most recent visit occurred in October when Putin traveled to Beijing for an economic summit. And then speaking at the St. Petersburg International Cultural Forum in St. Petersburg, Putin said that the China-Russia relationship was, quote, truly unique and had never reached such a height and quality in the history of our states. We've talked a lot about here at the Cipher Brief over the years, the real status between the Russia-China relationship. If you look back at the Cold War, you both mentioned that China was in a very, very different position than it is today, and Russia was as well. And they've almost flip-flopped just in terms of size and economic power and things like this. But can you both maybe talk a little bit about how you really see the relationship between these two countries? Is it what these two leaders say that it is, or are there fault lines that we don't see and weaknesses that perhaps we're not paying attention to?
Yeah, so I think it's real, and I think they share goals, geopolitical goals, to have more influence in their regions, respective regions, and then China globally. China's now the dominant partner. So if you contrast it with the early Cold War, when they were aligned until the Sino-Soviet split started in the 60s, this is very, very different. And of course, it's a more integrated world globally. And so China has economic power, although it's stumbled lately, that the Soviet Union never had, and connectivity with the United States. So, if you look at our trade relations, 720 billion or so of goods and services exchanged between the US and China, in late 1980s, it was 2 billion with the Soviet Union. It just dwarfs it economically.
No, and I agree with all of that, Michael. Look, let's put it right straight out there. In 1969, China was concerned about the Soviet Union nuking China. They were concerned. That's why China built underground cities in Beijing. There are underground cities. They were concerned about that, and that was the rapprochement with the United States, the threat from the Soviet Union. So now we see this alignment of Russia and China. What an irony this is in history. Yeah. They're coming together. There's no love between that. And I can tell you, China, there's no love when China looks. Even Vladivostok was taken from China as part of the unequal treaties. And, and it's part of Russia right now. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, as a supplicant, Russia is going to be a supplicant to China. There's no question about that. China is the dominant player on this. And this is a relationship of convenience. The tension with the United States drives and motivates China to work that much closer with Russia. And I think that's an irony, because I think the credibility of China working that much closer with Russia, a revanchist Russia, it depletes the credibility China has with the world, to include the global South, and indeed the Chinese people themselves.
Mm-hmm. I want to welcome a couple of our experts in just a moment to broaden this conversation out just a bit, and bring in some different perspectives. But before we do that, Ambassador Detrani, I know that you're, as I mentioned off the top in your bio, that you're participating in Track 2 talks at the moment. I mean, the United States and China are dependent on each other economically. The conversation about whether there was a decoupling that would be possible rose and fell already last year. There are areas where the U.S. really must cooperate with China. Things like North Korea and nuclear weapons, for example, which you write about often in the Cipher Brief. Things like climate, a lot of the topics that were covered when President Xi visited San Francisco last week. I mean, I don't know quite how to ask this question, but what I'm looking for is how gloomy is the perspective that there's going to be any opportunity to continue to work together on these very important issues while you see this strategic alliance building that is very anti-US?
Well, good question, Suzanne. I think what we saw with the summit, if you want to call it a summit, the dialogue between President Joe Biden and Xi Jinping just last week, I think is indicative of the relationship we have with China right now, and their relationship with the United States. we had some progress on mill-to-mill talks. Well, yes, we better move on that. I mean, we had the EP3 incident in 2001 where they held 24 of our crew members for 10 days in Hainan Island. We had the Belgrade embassy bombing in 1999 when China, and many people still believe, we purposely bombed the embassy in Belgrade. So we've had these moments before where we had to deconflict quickly. And you know what? For Belgrade and for the EP3 in Hainan Island, there was no communications. China didn't pick up the phone. So now with the South China Sea and with Taiwan, we better pick up the phone. China better answer it when the US calls and says, what are we doing here? So yes, I think deconfliction is so important. That's why we had some progress on that, mill-to-mill talks. And fentanyl. I mean, we've cooperated up with China not only on Afghanistan to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan, but we cooperated with China on counter-narcotics issues. And what an irony when we talk about the Opium War in 1838, and now we're talking about China restricting the flow of fentanyl into the United States. Well, China has to appreciate that because they were confronting that in 1838 when the British were sending in opium into China. So there's an irony, and history has a way of repeating itself. So I think China needs to start picking up the phone. China needs to be very serious in dealing with the United States and addressing some of the issues. I think deconfliction is so important, but also, as you alluded to, Suzanne, in your question, cooperation. There's so much there that we should be cooperative, whether it's pandemics, and that's a big issue, whether it's climate change, indeed, North Korea and nuclear proliferation. That's the whole of Northeast Asia. So yes, thank you very much. We have to be moving in that direction, and that's what the goal should be. I think the APEC Dialogue Summit was moving in that direction, but it was slight movement in that direction. We have to move with the, I'm talking about China because China has been the reluctant one to pick up the phone.
Dr. Vickers, are you concerned about the possibility of military action given what's happening in the South China Sea, of some either accident or I don't want to say attack, but some engagement spiraling into something much bigger very quickly?
Yeah, I mean, we had a accidents at sea protocol with the Soviets in the Cold War, and we had a hotline and communications for all sorts of crises. And it's good to have that with the Chinese. They suspended it recently, and they've never been a huge fan of it. The South China Sea is the most likely arena where you could have that. The Chinese answer has been there won't be a problem if you just leave the area, and which we're not going to do. But I'm fairly skeptical about the fentanyl commitments. They made similar ones, I think, Joe can correct me, I think in 2019 or 2020, and stopped it for a bit, and then it seems to have resumed. And I'm even more skeptical about the safety and AI cooperation. I think there's just too many incentives in that area for economic dominance, but also military and intelligence applications that, that competition will go on.
Interesting.
I think General Breedlove has a question. If
Yeah, let's welcome General Phil Breedlove to the conversation, and then also Paul Colby, former senior CIA officer, to this conversation. General Breedlove, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, and it's always good to listen to people who really know what they're talking about and can bring some insight and wisdom to this. So I'll thank Dr. Vickers and the ambassador for that. I love some of the words you used, and I absolutely ascribe to your characterization of the relationship between China and Russia. I do not believe that's well understood in America, and part of that is supported by some pretty bad 24-hour news reporting that wants to hype this collusion and the possibility of them becoming a strong military alliance against us. I would like to ask your opinion. There is an undercurrent of people who believe that there is some good that comes from the China-Russia relationship, in that some believe China is actually helping to restrain some of the Russian rhetoric about nukes. The line goes that Russia and China share the longest border, and China is not very happy about Russia whipping up the nuclear discussion for fear of that kind of thing happening along their border. So I would love to hear you two learned gentlemen talk a moment about whether you think there is any goodness there, and then maybe how do we help foster that if in fact it is goodness.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing, General Breedlove, that China has been fairly helpful on urging Russian restraint on tactical nuclear weapon use in Ukraine when they've been rattling that saber a lot. You know, a lot of the benefit the Russians get out of that is more the threat of use rather than the actual military use, as I know you know. You know, since the end of the Cold War, Russia has maintained 10 times the number of so-called battlefield nuclear weapons that we have. You know, again, I know you know that. And with not only an eye toward NATO, you know, nuclear weapons use is embedded in Russian military doctrine, but their long border with China. And as Ambassador Detrani mentioned, you know, the Russian Far East is an empty place generally, and you know, the Russians are concerned about that in long-term security. So there's an interesting angle to that, I think, from the Chinese perspective, and maybe wanting to deter this use. But you know, Paul's certainly an expert on all things Russia too, so he may want to weigh in.
So let me just comment, and then Paul, if you would, I'm not sure how much China is restraining Russia in its rhetoric on the use of tactical or strategic nuclear weapons. Maybe there is a little bit of that going on, but look at what China is doing with their own nuclear capability, their own nuclear forces. I mean, China is building up significantly, exponentially. By 2030, our estimate is they'll have over 1,000 nuclear weapons. By 2035, comparable to what we and the Russian Federation have in regards to nuclear weapons. And they have a very vibrant triad system also. So I think, and China certainly has a significant number of tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, it's the United States that walked away from tactical nuclear weapons, and both China and Russia have significant numbers of those tactical nuclear weapons. So yeah, I mean, I think the whole question of the nuclear piece is of real concern, because especially now with Russia walking away from, if you will, some of their obligations with the New SALT treaty, New START, I should say, commitments, and others, one has to wonder about the whole question of arms control, and the likelihood now we'll be looking at a nuclear arms race, possibly not only to include those nuclear weapon states, but others, if South Korea and Japan and others want to start moving in that direction. So I think the nuclear issue is a real one. Paul, what do you think?
Well, I was going to ask exactly that question of what a new strategic nuclear triad, i.e. strategic parity, rough between US, China, and Russia, how that impacts their relationship and how they view each other. Does Russia become more wary of a China which has, you know, rough nuclear parity, which takes away one of the things that they've held as their pillars of foreign policy of we're one of only two nuclear superpowers. That's no longer going to be the case. So I guess that's a question I would ask. Just a quick comment on those that would give China credit for restraining Russia's use of nuclear weapons. I think that's looking at the issue perhaps a little too narrowly and ignoring the fact that China is supplying Russia with dual-use materials, if not weapons, and I think indirectly, at least, via North Korea supplying weapons, certainly supplying moral encouragement. And we know that a number of Ukrainian officials on the eve of Russia's invasion received calls from Chinese counterparts saying, save yourself, your country is doomed. So China is clearly trying to, from my standpoint, trying to play a bit of both sides of the fence, hoping to, if the fighting stops, that they might be able to play a role in reconstruction of Ukraine under whoever regime that falls. And I think they would prefer that it falls under Russian domination. Their arguments about protecting honoring sovereign borders ring pretty hollow in this case. I want to ask a question of everyone here, and that is, been a lot of discussion of where Russia and Chinese interests converge economically, politically, militarily, but does anyone see areas where they significantly diverge?
Great question.
Well, Paul, if I may, how they diverge, I think China, when you talk about credibility, China with the Belt and Road Initiative, and you mentioned Ukraine, and Ukraine is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. I think it's a question of credibility for China, for China to be a major player with over 100 countries, members of the Belt and Road Initiative, looking at the global South, expansion of the, if you will, the BRICS, and even the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think China's credibility is on the line, working with and dealing with a revanchist Russian Federation. So I think China's credibility, and I think President Yoon Suk Yeol of South Korea made it very clear just a few days ago when he implored to China to sort of stay away from Russia, because Russia is depleting your credibility globally. And I don't think China wants to be, if you will, aligned with a revanchist Russian Federation that is doing what they're doing in Ukraine and what they would be looking at for the whole of their former Russian republics, the whole of Eastern Europe.
I have to think China was also quite attentive and quite worried when they saw Prigozhin on his road trip towards Moscow. It must have caused them some real concern that a foundational pillar of their foreign policy and their military strategy could evaporate.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say, I would just add, I think there's competition in Central Asia, and it seems like the Chinese have had the upper hand economically there. I think also, the Chinese see themselves as the dominant power. Most analysts, I think, would conclude that in the relationship. I don't think Putin likes that very much. So I think another.
Well, I'm sorry, Mike. Paul, I think we're also seeing a little bit of sort of direct friction in the country of Georgia. Russia sees that as their backyard. China sees that as an east-west throughput point. And as you know, there's some significant infrastructure there, even as it relates to cyber and throughput that is a bit of a friction point, as both sort of jockey to be the lead sled dog in that part of the world.
So I'll just pile on to that, Paul. I agree with both Phil and Michael. But when you look at the stands, Kazakhstan and all the stands, China is making major inroads into that part of the world. And as Michael said, for the Far East, Siberia, and now you're looking at the stands themselves, China is becoming very clearly the dominant player in this region, and Russia has to be very concerned.
Let me ask you all as well. The Cipher Brief was in Brussels at NATO headquarters earlier this year for a series of interviews. And General Breedlove, you of course served as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO for a number of years. It was interesting to me to hear some of the concerns that NATO countries have had regarding China. How are those alliances looking to you?
Well, first of all, as already has been explained well, the whole endeavor of the Belt and Road Initiative is encroaching on countries that NATO countries want to have stability in. And they see China, well, let me just give you an example. The last time I traveled Africa, 7 nations, after landing in those 7 nations, no matter where I landed in the country, my road to the capital took me past the new soccer stadium that China had built in those countries. And so NATO sees soft and hard encroachment in many nations that are important to them for lots of reasons. And most of that is vis-a-vis China.
I have a Can I ask a
You can
question?
jump in.
So we're getting new at this co-moderating thing a little bit, but Dr. Vickers, in your book, I want to shift a little bit and talk about deterrence. And I know this is something that General Breedlove and we've talked with him a lot about. You had some really specific recommendations that were forward-looking as it relates to the U.S.'s operations and ability to operate in the South China Sea or in the Indo-PACOM region. I wonder if you might share any feedback that you may have received since writing that. Some of those recommendations, if I'm recalling this right, would be some fairly radical changes for DoD and how they're thinking and the types of weapon systems that we procure. And I just wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about any feedback or that you may have received. And then just more broadly, the topic of deterrence in the modern world. It seems like this is an issue that the US might be struggling with a little bit in terms of China and Ukraine. I know General Breedlove has some comments on the Ukraine issue, but I was really struck by some of your recommendations forward-looking at the U.S. military competition with China. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, no, I haven't really received many comments on that. I think it's just too detailed for most people who read the book, whether they agree with it or disagree with it. It's kind of in the weeds a lot. But basically, the argument was that space superiority is to the 21st century what air superiority was to the 20th. And air superiority is still important, obviously, but space really matters if you're going to be a global power. And China's made a lot of strides in that area. And it's an area that it's very important for the US to stay ahead in. And then cyber is another area that will be enabled by AI and maybe quantum computing as well. It's also a global domain. So these two new global domains need more attention than they've otherwise gotten. And in both of those areas, deterrence is either untested in space or it's not working very well, like in cyber. It works at the high end for in extremis attacks. It doesn't work for the day-to-day activity. And then deterrence, and then other things about, defeating, restoring deterrence in East Asia. I argued for more of a shift to long-range strike and undersea warfare areas where we're strong, but also a shift more to unmanned systems. One of the challenges we've had is that our military has become demassed in certain areas. We have more capable platforms, but fewer of them. And, automation may be an area. And DoD is actually starting to move out in that area with things like cooperative combat aircraft that General Breedlove knows better than I do and stuff. So, the Russia problem's a little different because of time, distance, and the need to have land-based forces, both air and ground in the area, but needs attention as well. Deterrence more broadly has been weakened, I think. Just to take the Russia-Ukraine case, they intervene in 2014. We really don't do much. They intervene in Syria. We don't do much. They intervene in our presidential election in 2016. We don't do much. We abandon Afghanistan. And then he gives a crazy speech that Ukraine's not a real country, and we don't react all that strongly to that. And it's kind of waving a green light, I think. But General Breedlove probably wants to weigh in on this one.
Mm-hmm.
So, no, I'm in violent agreement with everything Dr. Vickers has said, but may I just also dive a little deeper into a couple of his remarks, and the good doctor will grade my paper if I get too far off of the boundaries. But, in a larger sense, to me, deterrence, we have to remember it's less about the capabilities and the shiny things. I mean, those are really important. But for me, it's more about intent and credibility. And I think that's where we're really taking a hit now. And Dr. Vickers mentioned this in his latter remarks. We still have some incredible capabilities and capacities that other people like China don't have yet, or Russia, certainly. They've demonstrated some real problems in their capabilities and capacities. But what other nations have that we are, I think, losing daily is that credibility and signaling of intent. And I don't want to get too far down in this rabbit hole, but my favorite, or I should say my least favorite set of sayings are sort of our stated American intent right now about Ukraine. And that is, we'll be there as long as it takes. and we'll give them everything they need. I know that these gentlemen would agree with me, but any military person that hears those are completely incomplete sentences to a military person. We'll be there as long as it takes to hold a birthday party or to cross the river or what. It's to do what is the completing part of both of those sentences. And to Dr. Vickers' point, and to the point I made, credibility intent is not stated in those two incomplete sentences. And I think this is a place that we're losing ground around the globe because Mr. Putin has demonstrated his intent and credibility for attacking across borders. 2008, we rewarded bad behavior. 2016, we rewarded bad behavior. 2023, we're already talking about rewarding bad behavior again. And I've raised 3 children and I'm helping to raise 2 grandchildren. And here's what I know. You reward bad behavior, you reward bad behavior, and you reward bad behavior. You're not going to get good behavior down the line. Okay. And so I'll stop now. I got up on top of my soapbox.
So can I just comment on
Yes.
on that? And I like what both Phil and Michael said. Look, I want to pivot to the Indochina region, and what we're doing with AUKUS, with the Australians and with the UK on the focus on submarine capabilities, which is what China has been working on very, very diligently for the last 10 to 20 years on improving their basically submarine capabilities and anti-submarine capabilities and so forth. So when we talk about deterrence, AUKUS, I think, is a big part of it. What we're doing with South Korea and Japan, with the in the Camp David summit between President Joe Biden and Fumio Kishida and Yoon Suk Yeol of South Korea. And as we speak now, we have an aircraft carrier in Busan, South Korea, right now. That's part of our deterrence, and we're making it very clear to the People's Republic of China that in regards to the Taiwan Strait, free and open Taiwan Strait, and certainly to the element of Taiwan, peaceful resolution of Taiwan, any unification should be done and will be done peacefully, pursuant to our, if you will, our commitments to the Republic of China, Taiwan, in the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. So I think we're working, at least in the Indochina region, we are working, this administration, I give the Biden administration a lot of credit for working on that element of deterrence and getting that weaponry into Taiwan, sophisticated weaponry, and moving forward. So I think, but I definitely agree. With lessons learned, we've not been diligent in this area, and our signals have been very weak. And if we want enhanced deterrence, we have to be committed, and we have to be very, very clear about our intentions.
Should we introduce some questions from some of the attendees as well?
Yeah.
I know you've got a couple coming in.
Yeah. Patrick Gall, who heads up an organization called the National Technology NTSC. They are a cyber policy advocacy organization. He's a great friend of the Cipher Brief.
Primarily for CISOs, yeah.
He asks, he says, China currently owns or operates over 100 ports across the globe. What challenges does this present to the U.S. and our allies?
That's a great question.
Big challenges. Let me just weigh in on that. I mean, we saw in Djibouti, that started with Djibouti. This is very big, and this is part of their Belt and Road Initiative, where they go in and they work on these port facilities, and these are commercial port facilities, which obviously could be used for naval purposes and so forth. This is China's approach. This is soft power, and this goes back over 10 years. This is the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. This was Xi Jinping himself, very, very visionary in that regard, and I think we should be very, very concerned.
Kind of a follow-up to that, Dr. Vickers, for you, and love to hear other people's thoughts. China's been described as a pacing, challenge, peer-to-peer. I read something the other day that said the U.S. has never, and it could have been in your book, forgive me if I get this part wrong, the U.S. has never faced such a disciplined adversary, or not in quite some time. I wonder, in your personal view, how far do you think China believes that they can push the United States to that edge, whether it's in the South China Sea militarily or in some other domain? How far do you think that they believe they could push us in this conflict that's ongoing?
Well, I don't think they know yet. I think they are, just trying to still build their aggregate power, and I think prefer to win, as Sun Tzu, without firing a shot rather than pushing us over some edge. And indeed, in certain ways, she may, as Ambassador Detrani was saying earlier, may have, created a bipartisan reaction in the United States in recent years by being too provocative and not following Deng Xiaoping's guidance to, build your capabilities until you really are the strongest. So I think what's unique about China is, and I do have this in the book, is that, in the 20th century, we never had a major competitor who had more than 50% of our GDP. Nazi Germany, Soviet Union. Soviet Union actually was less by the end. Japan was 15%. China's already close to 70%. They've stumbled lately, but and so that economic escalation dominance we had, and maybe the technological leadership that has been part of the American way of war for a long time, may be under challenge in the next 30 years. And so that poses a unique set of threats to us.
I want to come to everyone for kind of closing thoughts and a takeaway in just a moment. But first, Paul, you were just recently retired as director of the Intelligence Project at Harvard University. And one of the programs that you do there is bring in fellows from around the world. I'm interested just to pull from you a couple of thoughts about how some of those fellows are seeing events develop and from their various perspectives from countries around the world.
Well, it's kind of interesting. So it was an interesting mix between who was focused on China and who wasn't. Who was not focused on China in successive groups of fellows were the Israelis, who came in and were wondering, what are we talking about? What's all this noise about China? Why are we so worried about it? I think, and was hearing a number of the same things about Russia, particularly vis-a-vis Ukraine. I think some of those attitudes and ways of thinking may be undergoing readjustment now, particularly given what we're seeing in terms of where China is on supporting Hamas, where Russia is clearly in supporting Hamas. The French were very interesting in that they said, wait a minute, notwithstanding the political embarrassment when AUKUS was announced, to their surprise, or not, depending on who you talk to. But the fact that they argue, look, we're a Pacific power. We have a real role to play, and they see a real blind spot in the U.S. and kind of a waste of opportunity of us pulling them in more closely vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific and China.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. This has been a fantastic, I really like this format, gentlemen. I think it's been a fantastic opportunity to engage with each other. I'd like to come to each of you for closing thoughts and sort of, these conversations are great, but where do they lead to? Like, what we really want from the attendee perspective is to hear what you're going to be thinking about and what you're most focused on in the coming weeks, months, and we're coming up on a new year. So let me start with General Breedlove.
So thanks for having me, and I'm sorry I ate up so much time. An interesting thought, not an overall thought. You used the word discipline when you talked about a China that we're facing, and an autocratic government or kleptocratic, however you want to describe them. Yes, they have that capability. But let's talk about how less disciplined we are in one complete respect. In just looking at Ukraine, we already have seen that we have a problem with our military industrial complex in its ability to create excess capacity and answer just the Ukraine problem. And now that we have Israel on top of that, and some competing, not so many competing areas, but a few competing areas. We see an even rougher road ahead for our military industrial complex. We all know why some of these laws and regulations were created. There was bad behavior in our past, and we had to bring some discipline to our country in the way that our military industrial complex acted. But I really believe that we're getting a real signal that we need to take attention to immediately, that we have to learn how to incentivize our military industrial complex to have some ability to expand rapidly in technologies that we need. Thanks for letting me be a part today.
Thank you. Paul, you want to follow up on that? I know that you are working with the Cipher Brief as we're getting ready to launch our second conference in Kyiv, Ukraine next year. And private sector involvement has been an important part of what's happened there. Closing thoughts for us?
No, I think, look, we saw it in the, just real quickly, we saw it during the closing years of the Soviet Union, their efforts to steal US technology, and the relative lack of engagement of US industry in helping the Soviets. We see completely the opposite side now. There was reference to the economic integration between US and China, but there's also a real downside to that, in that in many ways we are fulfilling Lenin's dictum that the capitalists will sell us the rope will be used to hang ourselves. So I think real wake-up call still needed with US industry in terms of the strategic impact of their microeconomic decisions.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Ambassador Detrani, closing thoughts. What are you most focused on in the coming weeks and months?
Well, two things, Suzanne, and thank you for this session. It was outstanding. Two things: the upcoming election in Taiwan in January of 2024. And indeed, with China is looking at this very closely, and there's a lot of intimidation going on now with the People's Republic of China towards Taiwan, with their aircraft coming into their zone of protection, if you will, their air zones, and some other indications that China may be looking at the potential of a blockade or what have you. This is of concern, because we're talking about, again, I go back to the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, a peaceful resolution, and our commitment to Taiwan to provide them with the weaponry necessary, indeed, if China should decide to use kinetic means to affect some form of reunification. So hopefully that never happens, and it's peaceful in that regard. And that's why deterrence is such an important part of it, not only providing the weaponry, but deterrence and our commitment. And the second piece, very quickly, is North Korea. I think, even in this recent summit between President Joe Biden and Xi Jinping last week, not much on North Korea. Well, North Korea is building up their nuclear capabilities and their ballistic missiles to deliver those nuclear weapons. And with the new doctrine of first use and preemptive use of nuclear weapons. And we see what they're doing with not only with the Russians, providing with Russians with artillery shells and rockets, but even Hamas. This is North Korea that's capable of proliferating what they have. And we saw it with Syria. So let's get serious on North Korea. And this is where China and the United States can come together again, as we did in the six-party talks, and show the world we are committed to working together on issues of mutual but global interest, like nuclear proliferation, and try to resolve the North Korea issue. Thank you.
Very important points, Ambassador. Thank you. Dr. Vickers, you get the last word today.
Sure. So again, fantastic group. And just to build on the China-Russia theme we've been talking a lot about, Brad, you mentioned about China being the pacing threat. They're really the greatest long-term threat, for economic and technological competition, and then, and the power that they're accruing, and then the global competition. Our best China strategy right now, as General Breedlove talked about a bit, is to really help Ukraine defeat Russia. Nothing would send a signal of deterrence and other things that we need to shift the balance a bit back in our favor than that, in my mind, in the short run. And so I hope the administration and the Congress step up to the plate this coming year to do that and be clearer about our objectives, as General Breedlove mentioned. And then I think that one of the big lessons that has applicability to China in different ways than Russia, but it's really that industrial mobilization that has shown big weaknesses for us in this conflict. It's hard to imagine it's the same country that was the arsenal of democracy in World War II, but we need to recover some of that if we're going to prevail in the decades ahead.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. I've really enjoyed this format. We got together right off the top to talk about strategic view of alliances from east to west. I feel like this is a very important conversation, and I think bringing in different expert perspectives has been very useful. Dr. Vickers' book, by all means, available. Again, a fantastic gift for Christmas if you're still looking. Joe Detrani, Phil Breedlove, and Paul Colby, we're waiting for you to write your books. Come talk to me about that. We're also very honored to host these expert conversations, to continue to have the opportunity to host these conversations at thecipherbrief.com. So I hope everyone will join us there. Thank you so much, and all the best to you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.